Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cross for Music Magazine videocast. I am very excited to have a special guest with us today. So we have Dr. Jessica Quiñones. Hi, Jessica. How are you doing today?
Hi, Natasha. Thanks so much for having me here. And hello, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining. So I have to tell you, the way I found you is, I always hear all the time about psychology relating to sports and all that kind of thing. And I thought, there's got to be something equivalent to that for music. So I just started searching, like therapy, psychology, and music. And I think your page was the first one that came up for me in the listings. So I'm so glad we're able to connect. Before we go into that, though, Jessica, can I ask you about how your music journey started? Because that's also a part of your story.
Yeah, Natasha, that's a really great question because it pretty much forms the foundation and the basis for everything that I do today. So I started, my career is as a flute player in the UK where I'm based, a flautist. I grew up in America, so I was a flutist, but I pursued all my degrees in performance. So having gone to conservatoire for my undergraduate, my master's, and then my doctoral degree is in performance musicology, which is again surrounding anything to do with performance, interpretation, flute playing. And so with that background, I also have done a lot of work as a teacher and educator in academia. And the thing that kept coming up for me, Natasha, as an educator in music, especially with working with high-level performers, so we're talking, conservatoire graduates that are undergoing the audition circuit for orchestras, or even amateur adults that were coming to me, it really dawned on me that a lot of times some of the things that I thought that needed to be addressed were not necessarily music related at all. It was something much deeper around self-belief, confidence, maybe even some trauma history that I was encountering. And one thing I was really frustrated by was, my training wasn't ready to tackle those things ethically. Obviously, I couldn't work in that field with somebody. And I thought, what I want to do is study and become a psychotherapist for musicians. So off I went and did all my training to become a psychotherapist in the UK and decided to really focus in with musicians and work in that niche. And it's been highly successful career addition, because I say addition because I'm also, you can see my music's done in the background. I still perform and teach and play and still keep my own music stuff going while working as a therapist with musicians.
Were you able to find, when you were going through the schooling process, like good mentors? Was it easy to find people that were doing also music and psychotherapy, or was that a little bit harder?
Well, there's like a music industry collective. There are people in the industry, but one thing that I have found is that it wasn't always somebody that was classically trained in the classical conservatoire tradition. So although, there's a huge industry around working with musicians, a lot of it might have been rock focused or working with maybe genres outside of classical music. Now, that's not to say I only work with classical musicians. My work spans all genres, all types of performers. But I would say that having been in the musical system in the Western conservatoire tradition, I think has lent a really interesting lens on the process of psychotherapy with somebody, because I know the industry inside and out, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think it's true for all performers. You have a lot of attention on you, but I think especially classical, as you mentioned, there is kind of this expectation of perfection. Whether we ever achieve it is a different story. But I think, there is a lot of, like you're saying, I always felt a lot of anxiety about not reaching that standard. But I'm curious, I think you touched on it just a little bit. Do you see with performance anxiety, is it like maybe introverts get it more than extroverts, or is it more, they've had a bad experience in the past? Or can it just be anyone at any point in your career, all of a sudden you discover performance is giving you anxiety?
Natasha, that is such a good question, because it's all of the above.
Okay.
All that I see in my clinic is literally every end of that spectrum. So a range from people that when they were younger, or even to a certain time period in their life, they were fine, they were free flying, they enjoyed their performing, and then something happened, there was a shift, either some kind of traumatic event or something knocked some of that self-belief. And then the performance afterwards started to become more traumatizing when someone is on stage, to somebody that has always been nervous on stage and has coped with it to a certain extent, but then just has decided they wanted to come see somebody because they don't want to live that life on stage anymore. They don't want to have to suffer and struggle. To people that are introverted, to people that are extroverted, people that on stage you would never even know they have performance anxiety, but they still want to work on it because it's such a struggle and they don't want to have to pretend and put on masks on the stage anymore. So it also is not about a certain age. It's not about a certain necessarily a background. It comes from all socioeconomic statuses, all types of people from all over the world. So I think that's something to really normalize here, that there's not one type of person that will experience performance anxiety.
I love hearing that. I was just, I'm still in the process of watching this biography on Joan Baez, and she was saying how, anxious she would get. And you just would never know from seeing her performances what she was dealing with. So I'm curious, when someone has made the decision to say, okay, I want to get some change, I want to get some help, what does that process look like when they start coming to you?
That's such a great question as well. So I think it really depends on what the person that comes to me wants from the therapy. Okay. So an example of goals might be something like, Jessica, I really, really want to be able to go on stage and I want to be able to be authentic in who I am. I want to show my vulnerability to people. I want to be able to be okay making mistakes on stage and knowing that it won't end my career necessarily. These are some examples of some of the things that people come for. Or something like, I want to get to the point where I can even do one performance because I haven't performed in X amount of years. And the last performance was so horrible and it went so traumatically wrong that I want to be able to perform at a very, very small scale type of event without having to run to the toilet.
Yes.
To something even maybe performance goal, or for our work together would be, I want to look at where some of these feelings I have about performance come from in my history, in my developmental stages. Other goals might be like, instead of performance anxiety, I would like this instead on stage. So it's very nuanced because everyone has different reasons for wanting to work on the performance anxiety side of things. But from a clinical perspective, one thing to know is there also is ties to other anxiety types of presentations. So generalized anxiety disorder, for example, or social anxiety disorder. And that's not to say that all people that have performance anxiety will suffer from those, but there are some interesting correlations between having presentations in those other areas and performance anxiety.
So you talked about that one about, being authentic on stage, being less afraid of mistakes happening, right? Do you find that as people go on that journey, maybe even the style of music or the venue that they perform at changes to suit them, and then that kind of alleviates, through your discovery together, that takes away some of the fear?
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said about familiarity on stage. So knowing the venue, knowing more or less the type of audience that's going to attend, not being able to ruminate so much about what's going to happen because there's some already practice in having performed at that venue. I definitely think that's part of knowing or being able to ease one's performance anxiety, having been there before. But that being said, that is generally a very rare occasion that a performer will be all the time on the same stage, unless you're maybe an orchestral musician that plays in the same venue, or even someone in the pit, for a musical that you're going to the same venue all the time. So a lot of it is about being able to come to terms with the audience being the unknown factor, not necessarily knowing who's going to be there, not knowing what people think of you, and maybe ultimately not having the pressure to win over your audience, as controversial as that sounds.
Yeah, I feel like that must be quite a difficult hurdle to get by. But, at the magazine, we do a lot of crossover steps. And I think something that I've heard from a lot of people is sometimes when they give themselves a little freedom away from the strict classical or opera, it opens up things for them. I think I read something similar for you where you do these boho retreats, you do different things as well. Did you find any kind of, more freedom from going a little bit more crossover?
I think that's a really beautiful question, Natasha, because Part of my doctoral studies was looking at the music of the tango, and it was the one music that I was playing at the time on my flute, that I felt like I could be a lot more free and more nuanced in the score. I felt like there was less rules in my interpretations. So I would definitely say there's something about freeing oneself from the notion of being the perfect performer, reading every notation as something that needs to be revered and kept really sacred.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think 10 years on from doing a doctorate, I think now I look back on that time and think, well, actually, I could have done that much more with, I do that now, with my classical playing. Like I could play Bach and I feel much more free, and I don't feel like I have to adhere to maybe the performance constraints that would be in the culture of classical music. Maybe that's because I've given myself a lot of permissions, I think, through my own personal work to be the performer that I want to be and not feel like I have to make excuses or fit into a box. So I think it's a question of maybe about one's ethos and one's value system within the classical genre, shall we say?
Yeah. And do you think some of it is our own, because we want to be accepted so much that we're putting all this on ourselves, whereas it's not necessarily coming as heavily from the people around us when you're thinking classically speaking? I mean,
I think this is a really good debate, and maybe I'm putting my academic head on here when I'm thinking about answering this question, but there's actually so much performance philosophies that talk about something like a constraint mechanism, and the constraint mechanism is in the culture of the performance traditions, and it keeps everything nicely boxed in a way. And it's like there's a really beautiful term by John Rink, who is a performance musicologist, that talks about informed intuition. And it's like intuition to a certain extent when we play, but it's always informed by some kind of cultural norm. I think we ride the tide of both, wanting to be innovative, artistic, push the boundaries, but always within a little bit of a constraint, because then it's not necessarily within the genre. And how far we straddle each of those boxes and how much we're willing to push the boundary, I think, is what makes style for performers in a way. Our own performance style, our own artistic style.
Yeah, I like that thought. And I think if you go more to the popular worlds, obviously they might, again, I don't want to generalize, but it might require more like outgoing, like you think of a rock performance, they have to really put a lot more to amp themselves up. So, it's just different. Same but different things that people are battling.
I think you're onto something, because one of the things that I observe is that the more innovative and the more you push the boundaries in some other genres, the more respected you are as a musician. So how far can you push that score? How far can you push your improv, your ornamentation, or even the keys that you're playing in? Like that's kind of the holy grail. It's the opposite of following the score. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm curious, once a person, you've defined a goal now, what are some of the strategies that you use with people that are trying to, let's say, go the path of they're just trying to get back on stage again after that long absence?
Well, I would recommend probably speaking to somebody like a therapist if one can, and if it's available and it feels like something that's economically viable, because I think therapy can be the expense can always be a barrier. I'm going to be very realistic about that. But there's something about trying to decide what would life be like if you didn't have the performance anxiety. So looking at it from the opposite perspective, like what would you be doing differently? And really tapping into that. So an example might be like, well, if I don't have performance anxiety, I probably will be able to be more free in my playing. And then you can start to be a little bit more specific. Well, what would be more free? Well, I probably won't have the throat tension that I have. Okay, so then what would that do for your singing? Say it's a singer.
Yeah.
Well, I probably would be able to have more resonance in the throat. I'd be able to have more color added to some of the lyrics that I'm singing. Okay, but then why? What would that do? So we just keep going on this journey. Like what's going to happen if you get rid of the performance anxiety? Like what's going to be in its place instead? What's going to fill that hole instead? Because sometimes the performance anxiety, from my work with several, like many years, is something that holds on to preventing some kind of attachment or relationship to your audience, or it's like something that is a safety net for holding one back. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
And I'm not saying that that's like that for everyone, but it's like,
Yeah.
okay, what would really happen if you got rid of the performance anxiety, and why is that important? Because that's really what we're working for.
Yeah, that really flips it on its head when you think of it that way.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So if someone realized, for instance, that they are afraid of that vulnerability, and they decide, I have the means to pursue therapy, what does that journey look like for them?
So then the therapy goal becomes different. It's not how do I get rid of the performance anxiety? It's what permissions do I need to give myself to be vulnerable?
Mm.
And then we start to work on, okay, so what does vulnerability look like to you? And where did you learn how to be vulnerable? Who was vulnerable with you when you were a child? We start to look at a lot of past maybe decisions that were made from early developmental stages to maybe affecting your belief system today about vulnerability. That's like a very small example.
Yeah, but wow.
But I think to go back a little bit about when someone decides they want to conquer some of this performance anxiety, the other thing that I should mention is in the industry, there's a really interesting performance survey called the KMPAI.
Okay.
That's a really fancy acronym for the Kenny Music Performance Anxiety Index. And it's this fantastic 40-question self-filling type of survey. And it functions on a Likert scale. So it's like 0 to 6, and you circle the number. And it asks about different ways that you feel, not only about yourself on stage, but asks a little bit about family history with anxiety. It asks about what kind of somatic symptoms you might be experiencing. And I use this tool a lot in my work with musicians because it's a really good starting way in to understanding how a performer presents on stage and how they think they present on stage, if that makes sense. So it's self-reporting. So, and then at the end, because there's so many different ways that music performance anxiety can present with people, it allows a little bit more categorization of like, okay, so what's going on for you? So according to, this survey, it looks like that you have a lot of trait anxiety in your family. Well, that's a little bit a different type of therapy work, because that means it's something that is maybe more physiological that we'll be working with. Whereas someone say like, oh, actually, I have a lot of cognitive dread before performances. So cognitive dread is a way that we speak to ourselves and we kind of catastrophize what's going to happen before a performance starts. Well, that's a different type of aim of therapy. So the therapy will then be directed about how we talk to ourselves internally and looking at all the different ways that we internalize making sense of how we speak to ourselves, kind of the inner voice. Whereas another presentation might be sole somatic symptoms, like it's a lot of somatic symptoms, specifically like say shaking. So then we focus on, okay, so let's talk about the shaking, like what's happening for you. Tell me, when does it start? So we start to look, we do a lot of somatic work. So the therapy is never necessarily always about performance anxiety as one big generic thing, but it's the work that I do with musicians. It's always siphon down, looking at not only root causes, but also what does it mean to get rid of it, and how will your life be different, if that makes sense. So looking at change in a positive way instead of trying to just solely eliminate something, because then something has to come in its place.
I love that. I feel like you've given me a lot of food for thought. I'm going to have to journal after this meeting. But can you share, Jessica, if you've had experience either like a typical breakthrough or just a success that you've seen that has really, made you proud as a psychotherapist working with people?
Oh my goodness. Well, I can't speak like specifically about the clients, but I think the thing that excites me the most is when a client comes and they're at the point where, they're professional performers, so they can manage their performance anxiety on stage, but it's afterwards they might be totally falling apart. After performances only, they have to go to bed for 2 days because it was so traumatic on the nervous system to perform in that setting with that audience, etc. Seeing somebody that's come from that type of scenario, then be able to actually enjoy themselves on stage, be able to come to their session maybe the next week and say like, Jessica, you'll never believe I actually enjoyed my time on stage. And I'll say like, tell me more. And they'll say like, I actually felt like I enjoy music again. I enjoy making music again. I enjoy being with an audience again. So there's something there that I think is really special. And I guess on the flip side of that is to also know that sometimes these changes are really nuanced. So it might be like, Jessica, I had a breakthrough. I actually enjoyed my performance for 5 minutes this week. Whereas before, I hated it. So I'm like, okay, 5 minutes. That's a great starting point. You are able to maybe integrate yourself on the stage for 5 minutes, even 1 minute. Like, how brave and what a big thing that is. So that's my hope for all performers, really, is that there's a sense of being fully present, integrated, authentic, and not afraid to be vulnerable and imperfect, obviously within professional boundaries, and to be human on stage, because I think that's what people are interested in.
I love that. I saw not too long ago, I think it was early this year, I saw Audra McDonald, and of course, she's at such a high level. She decided to do this piece she hadn't done for 20 years. And, midway through, she forgot some of the lyrics. But you're just like, obviously the standard is so high, but I think it was also really nice for the audience to see, because then she just calls out to her piano, like, what's the lyric there? And then, of course, she goes on to nail the rest of the piece, But
yes, I love that. That's a great example, Natasha, because it's about relationship. I think when we're with our audience, it's about letting the audience come exactly as they need to come, because not everyone's going to love what you offer on stage. It's just a fact. It's maybe a cruel fact, but also knowing like the humanness is what connects. And it is all about a relationship with the audience. And it's not one that they're there to massacre you or to annihilate you, but they're there to be in your presence. And all you can be is be in yours.
So we've talked a little bit about, the potentially the financial burdens, but do you also think that perhaps just musicians going for therapy isn't as widely, like the awareness isn't as high that these services are available?
I certainly would think the latter, because I've had so many people contact me and say, oh my God, I didn't know there was a psychotherapist that specializes in musicians. Like, this is amazing. I don't have to explain things to you. I don't have to explain like basic things to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's always, really heartwarming, because there is someone, I can speak your language. I get it. I don't always get you, or I don't always get, how you view it, but I certainly understand a general lens of what is happening.
And do you think there's any kind of misconceptions? Because I know, for me in the past, I've had vocal injury, and it was a big hurdle to think, oh, I have to go to therapy. And then it was such a great experience. So do you think that there's any kind of those hurdles when people are thinking, oh, I'm going to go to therapy, that maybe we can correct?
Yeah. So are you talking about like psychogenic voice loss? Is that what you were having?
No. Sorry, I'm conflating two things. So I had paresis in my cord, but I think that there's, in the same way that there was, for me, I'm going to work with a speech therapist, and it felt really scary. Yeah. But to say, okay, I'm going to work with someone on my performance anxiety, and I think it's hard sometimes to admit you need help.
Yeah. I think that's really good to put here and to really account for, because there's something about being able to tolerate it and to wear the masks on stage as the norm, but then also being able to realize like it's not okay, and it's maybe not so healthy, and it will have its toll on the body and the nervous system overall. So yeah, there is something about really honoring people that are brave to come to therapy, because it's work. It's therapeutic work. It's not necessarily going to always be easy, and facing one's dark demons can sometimes be absolutely frightening. But the thing I hope people can take away about coming to therapy is that it's, with a therapist, it's going to be in a safe place. You'll never have to go at the speed that you don't want to go. You're going to be held. You'll always be working with a window of tolerance, never pushing beyond what's comfortable, and that's okay.
And Jessica, let's talk about, just because you mentioned you are a musician as well. I know you've done recordings. I listened to some of your beautiful flute playing on your YouTube channel. So can I ask, how do you juggle this? Because obviously you're doing, you're teaching still, I imagine, you're performing, and then you're also, providing the psychotherapy service. So how are you doing? Do you have a typical day, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So what I tend to do is I group all of my therapy work over a span of days. I group all of my teaching into a span of day, and then I do all my performing and practicing in a different time of day. So everything's pretty compartmentalized, because the work of therapy work, teaching work, they run very parallel and they inform each other, but they never cross, if that makes sense. So although I might be very therapeutic in the way I teach flute, it's never therapy. So it's always very useful for me to compartmentalize that work. And then what I've really found being a therapist with flute playing is that it's a great way to process whatever's happening for me or even clients. So it becomes almost like even a therapeutic tool for my own process in the work that I do. So how do I manage? I guess just very carefully and very diligently, but also very, very self-aware, not taking on too much of any one thing.
And can I ask, if someone is interested in pursuing something similar, would you say there's any character traits or, specific education? Obviously, you're certified and you did studies. Is there anything specific? Maybe you need to shadow someone before you make that decision. What would you advise a young person who says, I'd like to provide psychotherapy services for musicians, someday?
Well, I think definitely having some kind of knowledge of the music field or industry helps. So having been a musician or even learning an instrument, I think, is detrimental because of the process of what it is to be a musician, how much energy it takes to be a musician in today's world. So I think definitely having a background in the field is key. So secondly, I would say that musicians generally have many of the skills that therapists use. So I'll give you an example: having a good ear, being able to recall themes, being able to have memory in terms of what intonation people use, being able to carry a story and being able to string sentences together like a musician would. So there's already a lot of skills that musicians will have. But I would say that there's something about not feeling that one genre is better than the other, being very open-minded about one's training and background, and not feeling like if you're not trained in the conservatoire tradition, forget it, you're not a musician. So having to be very open-minded about what constitutes a musician in today's genre. Can you be a musician by layering sounds on your computer and then presenting them at festivals? Is like that okay? Having a value system that I think can be very, what can I say? Value system that can be open-minded about different levels of musicianship as well. I think that's important. And one other thing, Natasha, I'm sorry, I'm just so excited about, is something about realizing that the cultural framework that musicians work in is going to be different across genres. So I touched a little bit about this, but the cultural framework of a classical musician is very different than, for example, some of the artists that I work that are in the rap industry or that are in electroacoustic, and they're like DJs at festivals. Like, it's a very different cultural set of values. And I think really knowing that and honoring that they change from genre to genre is an important part of this work as well. So not appropriating values to one genre particularly, and always being curious about how people see it for themselves as well.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me, Jessica. I think I'd love to talk with you again. Even you were talking about, like voice loss due to, any other issues that are going on. So maybe that's a topic we'll come back to one day.
Absolutely. Psychogenic voice loss is something, I know it sounds really crazy, but I'm really passionate about working with vocalists about. So, yeah.
Yeah. So let's do that again. But let me just say, for anyone who's looking to connect with you now, can they do therapy sessions online?
Yes, absolutely. So most of my clients are all over the world. So most of my sessions are online. I work with, like I said, all genres, all backgrounds. The only thing that connects everyone is if there's a desire to share music with the world. So they can connect with me via my website, drjessicaquiñones.com. I have a consultation button you can click, and we can have a 15-minute chat to see if we'd be the right fit.
Sounds perfect. And then, as a flautist as well, do you have any projects coming up that you want to share?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm working on right now is an album by female flute composers. So I'm really passionate about sharing music from the female perspective, shall I say. So that's in the making, solo repertoire.
Perfect. Well, again, we'll have you back, but thank you so much for coming and speaking, Jessica. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Natasha. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for all that you do for this genre, especially the crossover part. I think it's really healing and healthy to have that mix.
Bless you. Thank you, Jessica. And everyone will have the information on the screen. Do check her out, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Natasha.